hope for the world is found in the message and mission that the church is called to share. The local church is a community of baptized believers living in covenant together, under the authority of the Bible, to worship God and engage the world as ambassadors for Christ. As we seek to know God and make Him known, it's helpful to rub shoulders with people who are serving the church well. We are the Time with Giants show. Join us as we spend time with giants of the faith, walking with God among us. Whether you are walking with God or are seeking to learn more about Jesus, welcome to our show.
Well, welcome to Time with Giants show. We are back in our season, and Caden is here. Emily, we're so thankful that.
Yes, for those who don't know me, my son Caden was born, and now we are back with season 3 of Time with Giants. It's such a joy to be here with you.
Now, remember, Time with Giants, our goal is to spend time with giants of the faith who are walking with God and serving the Lord and getting to rub shoulders with them. And today I am excited. We have Andy Coleman that's with us today, who is a giant of the faith and a leader in our church and really a leader among the persecuted church. Andy, we are so glad you are with us today, and we're excited to spend time with you.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it, but I don't think it's accurate to describe me as a giant of the faith. I've rubbed shoulders with a number of giants of the faith, and I've enjoyed championing them, but it's a real honor to be here. Thanks.
Well, you are a giant of the faith, and I'm thankful for the way God's using you and the contributions you're making to the kingdom, and I'm excited that our church family, those that listen to our podcast, have the opportunity to hear this part of your story.
I'm so excited to have you here, especially because this season we are talking about a healthy church. Mm-hmm. And it takes being a healthy church to survive being under persecution. Amen. And so it's such a fitting time to get to spend time with you for that reason. And also you just have experienced a recent trip that we're really excited to hear about.
Yeah.
So let's kind of lean in. You have a real calling to the persecuted church. Now, that's not something that you hear a lot. But tell us about your calling to the persecuted church and how that's fleshed itself out.
Well, I think God just moved in His own sovereign timing. And I was a young man. I came to faith. I was older when I came to faith, a teenager, 18 years old. Was a baby Christian for a number of years, went into the military. And it was in the military, I got deployed to Baghdad. And it was around that time, I was in my early 20s. And I had found a biblical church. And there was a pastor there who sensed that I was sincere in my faith, but I didn't know up from down in the Bible. I was biblically illiterate. And he was just in the process of discipling me when I got sent on this trip into Baghdad unexpectedly around that same time period. And during that deployment, I got to encounter Christians. I was growing my faith. I was aware that there was a Christian presence in these countries. And I actually was working with some groups trying to stand up. This was 2007, 2008. My unit was part of that effort to rebuild the country. So we were in villages, we're working with locals. And in particular, I worked with this network of nurses. And they would go in these villages, and there's a lot of hurting people, a lot of scared people, and a lot of Christians who are displaced.
Okay, that is fascinating to me because to show the power of the gospel that it was even in Iraq. Mm-hmm. That is just remarkable that you found Christians.
Yep, I did, and. It's one thing to read about them. You see it maybe in a newspaper. You hear about a story of Christian persecution. But here I was, and I was learning their names. I'm having meals with them at times. I'm playing with their kids. And my heart just exploded for these people. It was shortly after that I felt a very profound call to serve them and to serve alongside them. There's great things going on amongst the persecuted church. They have harrowing challenges, but they have a lot to teach us too about our own walk, our own faith. And I've seen the good the bad and the ugly. And I think it's important for us as Christians to be aware of them and their plight and to do what we can to champion them. But boy, we are really, going back to Emily's point, we have so much to be strengthened and edified by learning from their experience as well. So that's a very important piece of this too.
Yeah, I think about, I don't know that I have a frame of reference in my life to consider my faith in Jesus would be dangerous to my well-being. That if I prayed in public or if I exercised my faith, that would somehow cause bodily harm.
Or threat to people you love.
Yeah.
Or to your livelihood or to your home. Yeah, there's a lot of risks, and it takes time. I think, especially for any of the people listening that are just hearing about this or they're stepping into this topic for the first time, sometimes the enemy wants to beat us up and just be like, condemn us. Well, why didn't you think of this? Why haven't you? It takes time. So let's be gracious and give ourselves that opportunity to grow and breathe in all of this. But it takes baby steps. When I was in Baghdad, I got to meet them. I got to do small little ministry, reach out to my church and my family back home, and they got to supply some needs that they really had, which was really rewarding. But it's just baby steps, and it's just small steps of faithfulness. And it's true, too, when we as Christians are preparing for a day where we may have to sacrifice. We're called to a costly faith, and that day may come, it may not. But it's important, in my experience, to have these conversations and to prepare our hearts and our minds ahead of time, because then we're able to respond biblically rather than react. And sometimes when we react and we're surprised, we react in ways that we later regret. If anybody's been cut off in traffic, and you didn't see it coming, you're like, whoa, why did I react that way? But if you can know a little bit, like for me going into boot camp in the military, I had a few people that would just give me some tips. Here's what you can expect. It didn't make it any easier, but I did have a frame of reference, to your point. And it just helped me see scripture that applies, think through how would I respond in different settings and all of that.
I think we'll get into this later, but it just reminds me that to whom much is given, much is required. We've been given a lot, and so we should know about this so we can do something as believers in the United States and use what God has given us to bring help.
So, Andy, what has your calling looked like? How has that fleshed out in your life?
So it's moved in surprising ways. God placed me in different seats at different times, and I was actually practicing law in Kansas City, and it was a nice gig during a bad part of the economy. But I had this experience with my church, and I was helping them with some of the ministries that they supported. And I was at a gathering of Iranian Christians on behalf of this church. And at that conference, almost a physical weight, it's hard to describe, it came upon me. And I sensed that I was supposed to be in full-time ministry to the Persecuted Church through a unique series of events that ended up turning into a position with a large ministry where I got to work from Egypt to Pakistan. Deploying the little, like I said, that baby step of faith, just taking that and obediently doing what I could with the little I had. God takes that and he will stretch that. And I was able to do that for many years. I now am in business, and I also moonlight in ministry, still doing the same things in countries around the world. And yeah, it's been remarkable. It's been challenging. The enemy is fully engaged in this work. So you get to see that. You have a front row seat to that and how that can affect missionaries or people who are taking their faith seriously and taking risks for the gospel for Christ. But I've just been able to sponge that up now for 15 years or so. So
it's been intimidating, Andy, honestly, as your pastor, because there have been times that Andy would say to me, hey, I'm going to a really dangerous part of the world. Would you pray for me? Now, you can't say anything about it. And so I'd be like, oh, my goodness, I'd have to pray. It's kind of like that book by Erwin McManus, he wrote Barbarian Way. And in that book, it just captivated me because he was talking about his son. And he was asked the question, would you ever put your son in a situation that was unsafe? And Emily, had just been born, and when he responded, I absolutely would. I was shocked. But then he said, well, what about God? Have you ever asked God, would you ever put me in a situation that's unsafe? The answer to that question is absolutely he would. John the Baptist was. Andy, you have been in situations that were unsafe for the kingdom of God, and God is always faithful. Yeah. Hey, listener, I don't know if you have considered the call of God on your life. Let me tell you something. God didn't call us to a safe Christianity. He called us to a walk with God that's obedient, that sometimes will put us in a situation of harm.
Yeah, it's real. And again, going back to people just getting their mindset shifted around this, and I emphasize baby steps time and again. So if for some of you might be nervous about just being really clear with your conviction as a Christian, that might be a risk. I would just encourage you, trust God, take that little step of faith and just see what he does. When I first started in ministry, and I started in the Middle East in particular, I was nervous. And I remember praying, God, just never let me be alone. Never let me travel alone. I don't want to ever be exposed. I really never want to be kidnapped. So please never put me in a situation like that. And it was almost like God laughed. If you want to hear God laugh, tell him your plans or what you want. But in his tenderness, he got me in the Middle East, and I was around people for a while, and then I was around in a different season, a couple people, and then in another season, I was all by myself. But he had just stretched me and lovingly been with me. I was never alone. He was always with me. He just, kind of like your kids, when you're raising your kids and you're teaching a kid to jump off the diving board, and you'll catch them. And now jump off the diving board and swim a couple. It's like that. So I was really humbled. There was times where I would go on trips and I'd be like, man, this is a wild adventure I'm on. And some of them were wild adventures. But some of those wild adventures, I'd show up and I would meet a family from Illinois with their babies, tucked away in the hinterland of some distant country where there are not a lot of people from the West at all, but they're just raising their kiddos there, and they're doing amazing work. And I meet indigenous Christians doing the same thing. Some of them had opportunities to be in much safer settings, and yet God called them to some difficult spots, and they just lovingly carried out their ministry. And that's the other thing, is when you do lean into it, it's kind of like a wave if anybody's played at the beach. And as a kid, sometimes a big wave would roll in, and my first temptation is to try to get away and run away. And usually you get stuck, your feet get stuck in the undertow and you get plastered. But I learned eventually, if I just square up, sometimes I can just dive into that big wave that looks so scary, and it wasn't as bad as I thought. And in ministry and walking this out, you see that God's with you. You get the opportunity to meet amazing believers, to see some real things that God's doing that just really are stunning. And it's an honor to be a witness to that.
Speaking of wild adventures, I know that there is a situation going on in Nigeria with the Persecuted church. Mm-hmm. And you had an opportunity to go and serve there for a period of time. Would you share with us about your trip to Nigeria?
Yeah, so this was a recent trip in March 2024. Most of my time is in the Middle East. I've had some time in Asia, just a little bit of time in Africa, and really all of it was tangential to my work in the Middle East. I was always working with people that were trying to get into the Middle East. But there was so much going on in Nigeria, and we've been able, through a little ministry I'm a part of, we're able to support a little bit, but the scale of the persecution, of the violence, of the pressure was just reaching such a large scale that I was like, I have to dig in deeper. I have to find out more of what's going on. And it really is. Nigeria is probably the largest area of kinetic persecution against Christians today. You could argue that there's other countries where Christians are just as heavily persecuted, but what makes Nigeria different is that there's a big church there. There's a big Christian network there, and they're encountering large-scale, industrial-sized attacks consistently, and it doesn't get a lot of reporting. In fact, if the body count's not high enough, nobody even says anything. It's very hard for our ministry even to track it because it's so consistent that unless it's a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen, 5 weeks ago, 280 plus kids were kidnapped from their school. And that barely registered on the international media stage. So I went on this trip and I had an opportunity to connect with a lot of pastors. There was a pastors conference going on, and these pastors come from a region called the Middle Belt of Nigeria. The north of Nigeria is Muslim majority. It's largely Islamic. The south of Nigeria is largely Christian. But in this Middle Belt region, you could think of it as it's been heavily Christian. There have been Christians in the north too. But in a way, you could think of it as the contested space. And they've come under withering attacks from a variety of different groups. You have Boko Haram, which has been in existence for about 15 years, which is an Islamic group. You have ISIS in Nigeria. You even have criminals that are just taking advantage of some of the lawlessness that's happening. But the scale is significant. And while we were on this trip, just got to connect with, I mean, it was very hard to watch, but also very encouraging. There are so many opportunities. The scale of the violence is staggering. And one of the things that stood out to me is it can seem like this is impossible. Like, how can this Christian community continue to sustain hit after hit? And if you're just looking at the church in the Middle Belt or the church in Nigeria, it can look really overwhelming. But that's a reminder to me, and I hope a reminder to us, to your listeners, that we need to be better connected as a global body. If all of us as the church are like, we gotta pray over this. We gotta help. If we're mobilized, then it becomes a lot more palatable. But if they're left to their own, it's grim. So had the opportunity to meet with these pastors who are struggling, meet with a lot of Christians from these villages that have been overrun. And when I mean overrun, I mean overrun. Everybody kicked out. Even when they're kicked out and on the run, sometimes they're attacked. People will settle in their cities, and they'll even rename the cities. They'll give it an Islamic name. It's that serious. So thousands, tens of thousands of Christians displaced. Thousands have been murdered. Tens of thousands have been injured. There's a lot that are still in harm's way. So there's still these rural villages and areas where they're subject to attack. So it's very serious, but there's a lot of opportunities. And I'm just excited. In the ministry I'm a part of, which is called the Christian Emergency Alliance, we're downshifting hard because this is a strategic country. Africa, the church in Africa it looks like, when people are tracking the numbers, it looks like it's going to grow tremendously. So I heard a statistic that maybe 35% more Christians will be in Africa in the coming decade or two than there are today, which is a staggering number. But this contested region is going to be very violent. And I just, like my calling is to champion those that are in harm's way. And it doesn't have to be this way. Sometimes just a little bit of help, a little bit of assistance, and a little bit of daylight, a little bit of coverage is what makes the difference. So I hope that those that are hearing about this, and maybe it's the first time you even knew about this situation, I would just encourage you to lean into that wave that looks scary, and find out more and be very prayerful and see if there's ways you can help.
Yeah, I think it's so important for us to know to pray, to pray for strength, to pray for wisdom, to pray for ways God will use us. Because when you pray, you're moved to action. God doesn't leave us to pray for something and then stay still. He always moves us to action. And so I think part of the awareness of this is so very important.
Do you have any wisdom or insight on how the average Christian can find out about what's going on in the world?
That's a real challenge. It is not a priority of the mainstream media. They don't really care about these stories. And so one of the things that I've been challenging people is that to find sources. Go out there and don't rely on the big news channels at night. Don't expect to get good insight from the newspapers. Go find some good sources. Our ministry, the Christian Emergency Alliance, strives to help with some of that. We try to have some feelers out for what's going on in the world, and we'll just try to put out periodic accounts that we detect in these areas where you don't get a lot of news. There's other, World Magazine typically will have some good material on this as well. But you're going to have to be intentional to cultivate your news and to find out these accounts that are so important. And Chris, just something that you said about the prayer, the power of prayer, I can't overemphasize that enough. And that's taken me time to really appreciate, but it is so powerful. And on this last trip, I sensed there was spiritually, I sensed that it was very charged. When we first started really getting involved in Nigeria, there was even some spiritually scary stuff that I just started to detect. And but on this trip, one of the benefits of the ministry I've done for a while is I have Christian friends scattered all over the world, and on this trip, I mobilize them. So we're grateful for the prayers we had at our church, and we had Christians praying around this country in America. But I had Christians praying for me in Iran, in Israel, which is crazy if you look at the politics and the events of today. Christians in the Arab world, Christians in Pakistan praying over this. I mean, it was really palpable. I could really sense the Spirit moving. A lot of things happened that I'm convinced would not have happened apart from that prayer. We need to be in prayer. And don't allow the enemy to convince you that you can't do anything, that these problems are too big, there's nothing for you to contribute. That is a flat out lie. If all you do is pray, that's a big thing. And I'll just toss this in too, because I encounter, especially in persecution ministry, but also just in the church today, people sense that the temperature is going up culturally. It's a little less popular to be a Christian today, and some are expected not to live that out. And I encounter a lot of fear. And I understand. I understand where that comes from. But we need to remind ourselves that fear is not a fruit of the Spirit. And we need to combat that. And one of the ways that we can do that is prayer. I learned many years ago that one of the most compelling ways for me to do that is when I see a lot of scary headlines. I see a lot of stuff that's tragic and sad and hard to digest. But I learned that when that hits, when that news feed hits, or I see that headline, and my instinct might be to be scared or angry, but instead I've done a judo flip. I've learned this from others. I didn't come up with this, but it's like a jujitsu flip. It's this attack on your heart that God allows you to turn, and instead I use those as prayer promptings. If there's a scary story in Nigeria that I just heard about, man, I got to pray about Nigeria. I got to pray about the church in Nigeria, and I got to remind myself that there are people taking risks to advance the gospel of Jesus Christ in Nigeria, and all of a sudden I give thanks, and I have better context and better perspective, and my fear is gone. So whether that's Nigeria or even stuff in your own country or other news, that has been a wonderful tool that's really allowed me to stay closer to God and His Spirit and not succumb to this worldly temptation to fear.
I think that's really important because sometimes we hear about persecution for our faith and we think, oh my goodness, I couldn't handle that. Mm-hmm. But we overlook the fact that the Spirit of God gives us power to face anything that comes our way. Mm-hmm. And He gives us wisdom. He gives us words to say. He gives us strength in the moment. And this is the power of God. This is the joy of walking with God. And so there's real wisdom in this learning to pray. And God has really used you in my life to feel this. You have often told me that you go into places where you're meeting with people who fear the fist. Mm-hmm. But often in America, we fear the eyebrow.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know who said it. I heard it from somebody myself, but the saying is something along the lines of, here or in many countries, people legitimately fear the raised fist, whereas too often in the West, we fear the raised eyebrow. Yeah. And
I'm giving you credit for that. So I'm saying Andy Coleman said that. So
He's giving you credit on other episodes. I just want you to know.
Oh, that's hilarious. Well, I definitely have heard it. But it's like one of those things in any discipleship arena, somebody trained us at some point to pick that up. I think 10 years ago, that struck more powerfully. And today, there's still people that are fearing the raised eyebrow. They fear being considered weird or being considered different. But perhaps one of the unexpected blessings of this new era we find ourselves in the last few years, if
That's
you're a
right.
Christian, you're willing to live it out, you're starting to realize, oh, it's going to cost me a little bit. And do I really believe what I claim to believe? And so for more of us, we're maybe willing
Yeah.
to absorb that.
I think
Yeah.
God's moving the church in America
Yeah.
to go bring it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go.
And to wake up a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah. And so here's a funny story. This is a story from Asia. And I was actually in China. There's a lot of Chinese that were trying to work in the Middle East. And they had a lot of challenges. But I was there, and I got the privilege of meeting some of the leaders in some of the house churches over there. And there was a conversation where they relayed a lot of the pressures that they were facing from their own government. They had a lot of problems. And there was another Westerner there, and the Westerner was just like floored by all that they were hearing. And they were like, oh my goodness, okay, look, I'm going to go back and we're going to pray that all of this pressure and persecution stops. We're so sorry you're going through this. And this Chinese house church leader essentially came against them and said, don't you dare. Don't you dare pray that. Instead, pray that we would be faithful through whatever pressures God brings. And honestly, we're afraid that if the pressure were to all go away tomorrow, we would become soft like you in America.
Ooh, that's a good word.
Yeah, it was a gut shot. But that's just a wonderful example of how we can learn from those who have gone through the fire a little bit ahead of us. We can be gracious because we haven't had those experiences like those Chinese Christians have. That's why we need to have some grace. We have to have some grace and understanding with one another. Some people who are engaged in the type of ministry I'm involved in will come back and get really frustrated with Western Christians because they don't get it. And you just have to remind yourself, it takes time. It's baby steps. Let's help inform. Let's help them prepare for harsher treatment in the future, and we'll strengthen one another as a body. We need to strengthen one another as a body. That's so important. In fact, our ministry goal is to help the church stand, and we see it. We look at Romans 12. We look at the body. We look at the different parts, and we know that to be a healthy body, we need good nutrients. We need good theology. We need good connection. We need good ligaments. And that's part of where we come in, where we're trying to identify good channels for nutrients and help to go to where the limbs are hurting, where we're also backfilling some of the stress, but also the nutrients that come from their experience so that we can strengthen Christians in the West who are confused and don't know what to tell their kids. They're not sure what to do. They're not sure how to react. Well, it's Ecclesiastes. There's nothing new under the sun. And we can learn a lot from our brothers and sisters in Christ around the world today who are going through that. We can also learn a lot from our history, our Christian history, and we got to reclaim that story.
Well, listeners, I'm so thankful that you got to rub shoulders with Andy Coleman today. And, you know, honestly, I get it that you don't feel like a giant of the faith because it sounds like you've rubbed shoulders with a lot of real giants of the faith.
Yeah, but I also know me. You know me, and
well,
I'm not.
But, you know, seriously, though, there's going to be people in heaven. Sometimes we think, oh, it's going to be that preacher on TV or whatever. I think we're going to get to heaven and go, who's that guy with all those crowns over there and all because, or who's that lady? And, you know, because they serve the Lord so faithfully. Hebrews 11 talks about these people. You got to read Hebrews 11. Hey, let me tell you something. You ought to listen to Andy's podcast.
That would be a great resource to tap into some of these stories so you can be informed, so you can learn from some of these people who have experienced things that we don't quite understand in our culture.
So add the Christian Emergency Podcast to your lists because, hey, the link's there on the show notes and you can find it, just Christian Emergency Podcast. Check that out. That'll be very valuable. Also, there's a really great book. It's a historic book. It's called Fox's Book of Martyrs. It's an old book, but it's one you can get a hold of. It'll tell stories about martyrs, and I think you'll be encouraged. Not afraid. You'll be encouraged. Like Andy said, you'll be encouraged by their faith. And you know, Andy, speaking of, you know, I think you're right about persecution in America. As we close today, How do you see persecution expressing itself in the coming days in the United States? Because I have definitely seen a transition in the last 10 years. Where do you see this going in the U.S.?
I sense the pressure ticking up, and it's honestly already present. You know, in parts of the country, really blue cities. You know, even back in 2020, we had cases where Christians who took a stand for their faith paid a high price. They lost their businesses, their livelihoods. Some were even run out of town. I see almost like you saw hard authoritarianism in the 20th century in a lot of countries. There have been a lot of Christians who have been talking about a soft totalitarianism that's creeping up. But honestly, you see globally just this fusion of a very authoritarian spirit. Also with the rise of radical Islam, there's a lot of pressures coming, and it both could play out in the United States and in Europe. But again, none of this is new. We have brothers and sisters in Christ who have gone through this before, and we have a lot to extract from their experiences and learn from them. But we just have to be tapped into our history. We have to learn from others. We have to prepare our hearts and our minds and our families, our kids. We have to remind them that there are good, beautiful, and true things, even if they see stuff that's unpleasant. Your home has to be a safe harbor. You have to take discipleship of your family very seriously, and that's why it's so important for us to have healthy churches. So important for us to be in community with one another, with people who know you, who know when you're struggling and can come around, pray for you. It's why we have to be in the Word. But a lot of this is coming back to the basics. But we just have to realize that in the United States, the last several decades where everything has been very nice and chillaxed if you're a Christian, that was an anomaly. That's not historically the norm. Christians have had to pay a price. Going back to the birth of the church, I've just recently finished Eusebius, who catalogs the first 3 centuries of the church, and sometimes times were okay, and then times got really, really rough. But we have so much to learn from one another, no matter how harsh it gets. We just have to keep our eyes on Christ, and we have to be prayerful and lifting one another up, because the gates of hell is not going to prevail against the church. The church is going to advance, and that's Satan in a defensive posture. The gospel is going forward, and it has power. Prayer has power. The kingdom is advancing, and we need to remind ourselves of that. These problems, they seem big, but again, when we step back and look at the global church and how resourced and equipped we are, and even then, just look up and look to God, and to God, all of this is such a small thing, and we just need to lean into Him and His Spirit, be faithful, and take the steps, the baby steps that He challenges us to take.
Do you have any quick tips for parents who are wanting to talk to their children about these things? It can feel uncomfortable and intimidating, I think, to young parents, so at least to me. So what are some tips you have for parents about sharing stories of martyrs?
Find stories of martyrs and missionaries. There's some really great resources out there. YWAM, Youth with a Mission, they publish a number of these accounts, and a lot of them are designed for kids. So it's just a great opportunity to read these biographies of Christians who took risks, who were faithful, who sometimes found themselves in new settings. But it also not only helps them to understand the world that we find ourselves in, but it also taps into the adventure that is following God. It plants this seed of hope and adventure and excitement. And I also encourage people to read great stories of adventure, love, heroism, and even righteousness. I read a book where a mother in Eastern Europe, when she was younger, read to her kids. She would read Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien books, and just to plant a seed of good versus evil, and that good's going to prevail. And somebody asked, well, why did you read that? And her response was, well, because Mordor was real. We knew Mordor was real. And I could read these stories to them and help them to not just see what dark forces are out there, but also all the good, all the positive, to keep ourselves looking at the good and the beautiful.
Yeah,
So,
and you already, when you think about the power of the gospel, you already just earlier said about how amazing it was that you go to Baghdad, a place that you don't expect to find Christians, and you find amazing, lovely believers in Jesus.
yeah,
And the gospel will prevail
yeah.
throughout all history. Nothing will stop Christ from building his church. Andy, thank you so much for joining us, and we are grateful for your time today. Check out the Christian Emergency Podcast and these YWAM resources that Andy articulated. And hey, we're so glad that you came.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Time with Giants. We'll catch you back in 2 weeks. Thank you for joining us today. Remember, following Jesus means that we seek to do as he did. Whether you are learning more about spiritual disciplines or simply sitting at his feet, we pray that our conversations here might be a stepping stone on your journey to know God and make him known. As always, our prayer is Romans 15:13. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit, you may overflow with hope. Has our podcast been a blessing to you? Help us out by subscribing to our podcast and sharing it with others. To be a monthly supporter, click on the link in the show notes or go to our website at alifeworthfollowing.org. See you next time on Time with Giants.